I am Sydney, 33 years old, and spent 3 years playing the perfect, quiet wife to a man who thought his bank account made him a god. At a lavish backyard barbecue celebrating an academic milestone, his deeply unqualified son did not actually earn. My stepdaughter pointed her perfectly manicured finger in my face and barked at me to do my job like a common maid. When I finally snapped back, my husband rushed over, slapped me across the face in front of 50 guests, and screamed that I was nothing but a poor freeloader. He aggressively ordered me to get out of his house. I did not say a single word in my defense. I quietly turned around and packed my bags. The very next morning, he called me in an absolute panic. For the first time in my entire life, I heard my arrogant husband sobbing uncontrollably. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. The afternoon sun beat down on the sprawling manicured lawn of our Connecticut estate. Bradley, my 44-year-old husband, was holding court by the outdoor kitchen. He was a real estate contractor who wore his perceived wealth like a weapon, constantly reminding everyone around him exactly how much everything cost. Today was supposed to be a celebration for his 19-year-old son, Logan. Bradley had spared no expense catering a massive barbecue for 50 wealthy neighbors' clients and family members to honor Logan finally getting accepted into the University of Southern California. Of course, no one at the party mentioned the fact that Logan had been rejected 3 times prior, or that his sudden acceptance mysteriously coincided with a massive anonymous donation to the athletic department. I knew the truth because I handled all the books for Bradley's contracting firm. I saw every hidden line item. But to Bradley and his children, I was just the quiet, manageable bookkeeper who brought home a meager $40,000 a year. They viewed my forensic accounting background as nothing more than glorified data entry. I balanced a heavy silver tray loaded with fresh margaritas, weaving through clusters of people discussing summer homes and stock portfolios. My 16-year-old stepdaughter, Mackenzie, stood near the edge of the pool with a group of her entitled friends. She wore a designer sundress that cost more than my supposed monthly salary, a purchase she had thrown in my face just hours earlier. As I approached to offer beverages to their group, Mackenzie intentionally stepped backward, thrusting her elbow directly into my tray. The impact was violent and sudden. Crystal glasses tumbled to the stone patio, shattering into hundreds of jagged pieces. Sticky yellow liquid splashed across my shoes and splattered onto the pristine white hem of her dress. The lively chatter around the pool instantly died down. Mackenzie spun around, her eyes flashing with theatrical rage. She pointed her finger directly at my face, stepping so close I could smell the expensive perfume Bradley had bought her to apologize for missing her last birthday. "Clean it up!" she barked, her voice carrying across the entire patio. "Do your job, maid." The sheer audacity of her command hung heavily in the humid summer air. Several guests turned their heads, their conversations halting completely as they waited to see how the quiet, accommodating wife would handle the spoiled teenager. For 3 years, I had swallowed my pride. I had endured the snide remarks, the blatant disrespect, and the constant reminders that I was supposedly lucky to be living in a mansion I could never afford on my own. I had cleaned up Logan's messes and endured Mackenzie's tantrums because I was playing a very specific role. But standing there, surrounded by shattered glass and sticky spilled alcohol, looking at the cruel smirk on this teenager's face, my patience completely evaporated. "I am not your maid, Mackenzie," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. "I suggest you go find a mop and clean up your own deliberate mess and watch your mouth when you speak to me." Mackenzie gasped, her face flushing bright red with indignation. She looked around at her friends, embarrassed that her usual punching bag had finally decided to fight back. Before she could unleash whatever venomous reply was forming on her lips, heavy footsteps pounded against the stone patio. Bradley stormed through the crowd, his face contorted with absolute fury. He grabbed my arm with a crushing grip, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. Without a single word of inquiry, without asking what had happened or why his daughter was screaming, he pulled his hand back and slapped me hard across the cheek. The sharp crack echoed over the patio. The physical sting was sharp, but the public humiliation was intended to be entirely lethal. Gasps erupted from the surrounding guests. My cheek burned, but I refused to break eye contact with him. "You are nothing but a poor freeloader making 40 grand a year doing my books," Bradley snarled, his spit flying onto my face. "I brought you into this lifestyle. I gave you everything and you dare disrespect my daughter in my house. Get out of my house right now." I did not cry. I did not raise my hand to my stinging cheek. I simply stared dead into his furious, bulging eyes. I absorbed the reality of the man standing before me. I turned around and walked slowly toward the glass doors leading inside, my posture straight. I stepped into the cool air conditioning of the living room, heading straight for the grand staircase to pack my bags. But as I reached the bottom step, Donovan Bradley's African-American brother-in-law stepped directly in front of me, purposefully blocking my only path forward with a cruel smirk. Donovan did not move a single inch as I reached the top of the sweeping mahogany stairs. He stood entirely still with his thick arms aggressively crossed over his highly expensive custom-tailored suit, a thoroughly smug grin heavily plastered across his arrogant face. "You really blew it this time, Sydney," he sneered, his deep voice echoing down the corridor. I did not break my confident stride. I simply stepped right around his bulky, imposing frame and walked straight down the long carpeted hallway directly into the massive master bedroom. My mind was entirely clear and perfectly focused. There was absolutely no panic and certainly no tears forming in my eyes. I walked directly into the expansive walk-in closet and completely bypassed the endless rows of cheap pastel dresses Bradley had aggressively bought for me to play the submissive part of the modest, grateful wife. Instead, I reached straight for the very dark back of the wooden rack and forcefully pulled out 3 immaculate dark designer suits I always kept hidden from his sight. I laid my black leather suitcase open on the king-sized bed and began methodically folding the expensive garments with absolute terrifying precision. Heavy, aggressive footsteps quickly echoed against the polished hardwood floor right behind me. Bradley and Donovan suddenly appeared in the open doorway, casually leaning against the white wooden frame like a pair of highly triumphant predators finally cornering their trapped prey. "Look at her right now." Donovan Bradley laughed loudly, a very harsh grating sound that completely lacked any real genuine humor. "She actually honestly thinks she is going somewhere tonight. You are going to walk straight out into the freezing rain with absolutely nothing but the wet clothes on your bare back, Sydney. I gave you this beautiful life. I generously took you out of that tiny, pathetic apartment, and I freely gave you a literal mansion to live in. Without my powerful family name firmly backing you up, you simply do not exist in this wealthy town. You are just a glorified, useless calculator who could not even handle serving drinks at a simple family barbecue." I completely and utterly ignored his pathetic taunts as I zipped the inner compartment of my luggage. My silence seemed to infuriate him further. He quickly nudged Donovan. Donovan stepped into the room and reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and dropped them onto the glass coffee table at the center of our bedroom. The heavy thud echoed loudly. "This is a post-nuptial agreement," Donovan announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are going to sign this, Sydney, right now. It stipulates that you are voluntarily dissolving this marriage and forfeiting any right to alimony property or assets. You walk away with absolutely zero." I finally turned to look at them. "And why would I sign that, Donovan?" He smiled, revealing perfectly white teeth. "Because if you do not sign it, Bradley is going to file a massive civil suit against you on Monday morning. We will claim you made severe accounting errors during your tenure as his bookkeeper. We will bury you in litigation until you are entirely bankrupt. Be grateful he gave a nobody like you a roof over your head for the last 3 years. Sign the paper and Bradley will not ruin your miserable little life. He will just let you fade back into the obscurity where you belong." I looked at the document, then back at the 2 men who thought they held all the power. I walked over to the coffee table, not to sign the paper, but to pick up my watch. I secured the clasp around my wrist and picked up my suitcase. "Accounting errors." I asked, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Is that what we are calling it now?" Bradley rolled his eyes, crossing his arms over his chest. Do not try to play smart with us, Sydney. You messed up the ledgers. You cost my firm thousands. I let out a sharp laugh. It was a cold sound that made Bradley immediately drop his arms. Accounting errors, I repeated, stepping closer to him. You mean the $150,000 you secretly wired out of the corporate escrow account last month? The money you desperately needed to bail Logan out of his DUI hit and run. Bradley froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. Donovan stiffened, his smug smile vanishing completely. I turned my gaze directly to Donovan. And let us not forget your role in this little drama, Donovan. The wire transfer did not just go to a bail bondsman. It was funneled through 3 shell companies directly into an offshore account belonging to the brother of the local circuit court judge. The exact same judge who suddenly dropped all felony charges against Logan due to a miraculous lack of evidence. You bribed a sitting Judge Donovan to sweep a violent crime under the rug. Did you honestly think the poor freeloader doing Bradley's books was too stupid to trace the routing numbers? The master bedroom plunged into an icy, suffocating silence. The sound of the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows was the only noise in the room. Donovan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His legal mind was clearly short-circuiting as he realized the magnitude of what I had just exposed. I knew every dirty secret, every hidden transaction, every illegal bribe they had ever orchestrated. I had the digital receipts backed up on 5 different secure servers. Bradley's shock quickly morphed into a feral, panicked rage. The facade of the untouchable, wealthy contractor shattered completely. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us in 2 heavy strides. He reached out and violently snatched my mobile phone right out of my hand. His breathing was heavy, erratic. "You think you can blackmail me in my own house?" he screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You think you are leaving here with that kind of information?" He deliberately threw my phone against the wall, watching it shatter into pieces against the hardwood floor. "You are not going anywhere," he roared, his voice echoing violently through the massive house. "You are going to sit down at that table, and you are going to sign that document. You are absolutely not leaving this room until you do exactly what I tell you right now. You will obey me, or you will regret it, I promise you." The plastic and glass fragments of my shattered phone scattered across the expensive Persian rug. Bradley stood there with his chest heaving, his face a mask of purple rage, fully expecting me to drop to my knees and surrender. He expected me to cry, to beg for forgiveness, and to frantically sign away my entire life on that ridiculous post-nuptial agreement. Donovan adjusted his tie, wearing that same arrogant smirk, waiting for my inevitable submission. They thought destroying a simple piece of technology would break my spirit. They were completely wrong. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I calmly stepped right over the broken pieces of my phone, moving toward the heavy oak door of the master bedroom. Bradley stepped in front of me, raising his hand as if he might strike me a second time. "Where do you think you are going?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. I did not bother looking at his face. Instead, I reached deep into the inner pocket of my tailored black blazer. My fingers closed around the cold metal casing of a secondary, highly encrypted burner phone. I pulled the sleek device out and held it up. Bradley stared at it in sheer confusion. His brain simply could not process why the quiet, submissive woman he married was carrying a secure tactical device. "Who are you calling?" Donovan asked, his legal instincts finally sensing that something was terribly wrong. "You cannot call the police, Sydney. We have the local department in our back pocket, and you know it." I did not dial a number. I unlocked the screen with my thumbprint, opened a heavily encrypted application that appeared as nothing more than a blank black screen, and quickly typed 3 simple words: "Execute Protocol Alpha." I pressed send. I watched the confirmation checkmark appear, locking in a sequence of automated financial and legal events that would entirely dismantle their corrupt empire by morning. Bradley suddenly burst into a loud, mocking laugh. He truly thought I was bluffing. He thought I was texting some pathetic friend to come rescue me from the suburbs. "Is that your little escape plan?" he sneered, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "You are texting for a ride. You really are nothing but a pathetic loser. You think you can walk out of here and survive on your own? You have absolutely no one, Sydney. I own you. He grabbed me forcefully by my shoulders, his large hands digging into my blazer, and violently shoved me out of the master bedroom. I kept my balance, holding my leather suitcase tightly in my right hand as he pushed me toward the grand mahogany staircase. We descended the stairs with him aggressively crowding my space, forcing me down step by step. Down in the grand foyer, the last remaining guests from the barbecue stood frozen in shocked silence, holding their champagne flutes and watching the spectacle. Mackenzie and Logan stood near the kitchen entrance, openly laughing and pointing at me as their father physically paraded me out of the house like common trash. Bradley reached the heavy double front doors and ripped them open. The sky had cracked open and a torrential summer downpour was flooding the manicured driveway. Thunder rumbled deeply in the distance. He shoved me hard one final time, sending me stumbling out onto the wet stone porch. I caught my balance just before hitting the ground, but my expensive suitcase landed directly in a deep puddle of muddy rainwater. "Let us see exactly how long you survive without my credit cards, you useless parasite," Bradley screamed over the sound of the pouring rain, standing safely inside the dry, warm foyer. "Let us see how fast you come crawling back here begging on your knees when you cannot even afford to buy a cheap cup of coffee. You will be homeless by tomorrow morning." The freezing rain soaked instantly through my blazer, plastering my hair against my face. I slowly reached down and picked up my suitcase. I stood up straight, completely ignoring the cold water running down my spine. I looked back at the sprawling, ostentatious mansion and then locked eyes with the man who thought he controlled the entire universe. "Your credit cards?" I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy rain with absolute chilling clarity. "You should really check your bank balances at midnight, Bradley. Every single one of them." Bradley frowned, his face contorting into a mask of pure confusion. He opened his mouth to shout another insult, but the sound died in his throat. Two bright LED headlights suddenly pierced through the dark torrential rain. A sleek black bulletproof town car glided silently up the long circular driveway, stopping perfectly in front of the porch. It was not a standard taxi or a cheap rideshare vehicle. It was an elite executive transport vehicle, the kind reserved for billionaires and high-ranking government officials. The driver, a broad-shouldered man, wearing a sharp black suit and an earpiece, stepped out into the pouring rain without an umbrella. He completely ignored Bradley, walked directly over to me, and respectfully took my wet suitcase. "Right this way, ma'am," the driver said, opening the heavy rear door of the vehicle for me. I stepped into the warm, luxurious leather interior of the town car, without looking back at my husband. As the driver closed the door behind me, I caught one final glimpse of Bradley standing frozen in his grand doorway, the arrogant smirk completely wiped from his face, replaced by a creeping, suffocating sense of dread. The town car pulled away smoothly, leaving the mansion far behind in the darkness. I sank back into the plush leather seat and let out a slow, steady breath. The performance of the grateful, quiet wife was finally over. I picked up my encrypted burner phone once more, the screen glowing brightly in the dark cabin of the car. I navigated past my secure messaging application and dialed a highly restricted number I knew by heart. The line rang only once before it was answered. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division Director Vance. Speaking, a deep, authoritative voice answered on the other end. "Director Vance?" I said, staring out the rain-streaked window at the passing streetlights. "This is Special Agent Sydney. The cover is officially blown." Bradley took the bait completely. "Execute all federal warrants and lock down his entire financial network immediately. Bring his whole world crashing down tonight." The rain from last night had cleared, leaving the morning air crisp and the Manhattan skyline glittering with early sunlight. It was exactly 6 in the morning. I stood on the sprawling wraparound balcony of my $10 million penthouse overlooking Central Park. The cold marble floor beneath my bare feet felt incredibly grounding after the chaotic events of the previous evening. I took a slow sip of my perfectly brewed espresso, letting the rich, bitter taste wash over my tongue. I had not slept a single minute, but I was not tired in the slightest. The intense adrenaline of successfully executing a 3-year undercover operation kept my mind razor-sharp and entirely focused. I leaned against the thick glass railing, watching the massive city wake up far below my current vantage point. This penthouse was a private sanctuary Bradley knew absolutely nothing about, purchased completely in cash through a secure blind trust long before I ever met him. He genuinely thought I was a penniless bookkeeper who desperately needed his daily charity to survive in this world. He arrogantly assumed my entire existence revolved around cleaning up his suburban kingdom and enduring his horribly spoiled children. The heavy, peaceful silence of the early morning was suddenly shattered by a sharp, aggressive buzzing sound behind me. My secondary encrypted burner phone vibrated violently against the smooth surface of the wrought iron patio table. The bright screen illuminated, flashing an unknown caller identification, but I knew exactly who was on the other end. The timing was perfectly aligned with the exact moment the national banking sector automatically opened its secure servers for the day. I calmly picked up the sleek device and pressed the green accept button, bringing the cold phone to my ear. I did not say a single word, waiting for him to speak first. "Sydney, please tell me you are there." The trembling voice on the other end of the line was entirely unrecognizable to me. The booming, arrogant tone that had demanded I clean up, shattered glass, and threatened to leave me homeless was completely gone. Instead, I heard the pathetic, high-pitched wheezing of a thoroughly broken and terrified man. Bradley was hyperventilating, gasping for oxygen between loud, uncontrollable sobs that racked his chest. "Sydney, you have to help me right now, because I am completely ruined, and everything I built is gone." I took another slow sip of my espresso, keeping my breathing perfectly even and remarkably steady. "What exactly seems to be the pressing problem this morning, Bradley?" I asked, my voice echoing with icy detachment and zero sympathy. "My bank accounts. Every single one of them." He choked out the desperate words, sounding like he was physically suffocating under the crushing weight of his situation. "The corporate funds dedicated to the new housing development are gone. My personal savings and even the offshore accounts Donovan explicitly set up for me are completely frozen. I tried to buy a simple coffee this morning, and my elite credit card was instantly declined. I called the regional bank manager at his private home, and he actually hung up the phone on me. The automated system message says I am currently under strict federal investigation for a massive multi-million-dollar fraud. My furious investors are already blowing up my phone, Sydney, and they are literally threatening to kill me. What in the absolute world did you do to me?" "Sydney, please, you do not understand how this works," he begged, his voice cracking pathetically over the digital connection. I had to move that money quickly because Logan was in incredibly deep trouble with some very dangerous people. I was definitely going to put every single penny back immediately after the next big commercial real estate closing. You know perfectly well how this cutthroat business actually operates. You are my wife, and you are legally supposed to protect me from things like this. "I am a certified federal forensic investigator, Bradley," I stated clearly, enjoying how the heavy words landed like physical blows. "I spent the last 3 years meticulously documenting every single wire fraud, every fake invoice, and every illegal bribe you orchestrated. I submitted 5,000 pages of irrefutable verified evidence directly to the Federal Financial Crimes Unit weeks ago. I only stayed in your miserable, toxic house this long to quietly gather the final encrypted access codes to those offshore accounts." There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. The devastating reality of his absolute destruction was finally piercing through his thick, suffocating layers of pure, unadulterated arrogance. When he spoke again, his tone completely shifted from pathetic sobbing to a dark-cornered, desperate form of anger. "You are a dead woman, Sydney," he snarled, his voice shaking with feral rage. "Donovan is a brilliant corporate lawyer who knows every single hidden loophole in the entire judicial system. We will easily twist this entire federal investigation and pin every single forged document directly onto you. You were the lead accountant, and your signature is on the software logs. We have the digital footprint to prove you orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme completely behind my back. Meet me at the downtown cafe on 5th Street at exactly noon today. You are going to sign a full legally binding confession. I smiled into the phone. They caught you, Bradley, I whispered. You embezzled $3 million from your own investors to fund Logan's massive gambling debts and Mackenzie's absurd designer lifestyle. Did you really think the poor freeloader doing your forensic accounting was too stupid to notice I saw every single manipulated ledger? I am not meeting you at any cafe. I continued stepping away from the glass railing and walking back into the luxurious warmth of my sprawling living room. You do not give me orders anymore, Bradley. You have absolutely no power over me. The federal agents are currently seizing your assets, and Donovan is likely shredding his own files right now, trying to desperately save his law license. He will turn on you the exact second the FBI offers him an immunity deal. You are entirely alone. Sydney, please, you cannot do this to our family, he begged, the aggressive facade instantly crumbling back into pathetic desperation. We can fix this together. I will give you whatever you want. I will buy you a new car. I will put your name on the house. I do not want your heavily mortgaged suburban house, Bradley, I replied, walking over to my massive custom marble kitchen island. I poured myself another shot of espresso. I am standing in a $10 million Manhattan penthouse that I own entirely in cash. I bought it 2 years ago with the immense profits from my own independent investment firm. I never needed your cheap dresses or your conditional charity. I was simply gathering the ultimate proof to completely dismantle your corrupt operation from the inside out. A harsh, breathless gasp echoed through the phone speaker. You are lying, he stammered, his voice shaking violently. You are a nobody. You have nothing. Watch the morning financial news, Bradley, I suggested coldly. Horizon Digital just acquired the largest commercial real estate development firm in the Northeast. Look up the name of the chief executive officer. Enjoy your federal indictment. I ended the call immediately, severing the digital connection without waiting for his inevitable screaming response. I placed the burner phone on the marble counter and took a deep, cleansing breath. The heavy, suffocating weight of the past 3 years completely evaporated from my shoulders. I had successfully played the role of the quiet, submissive victim while secretly building an impenetrable empire entirely out of his sight. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my grand dressing room and examined my reflection. I had shed the cheap pastel dresses and the timid posture. Today I wore a razor-sharp midnight blue tailored suit that commanded absolute authority. My hair was styled perfectly, and my eyes held a fierce, unyielding determination. I was no longer the convenient punching bag for a family of toxic narcissists. I was the architect of their ultimate downfall. My primary business phone rang loudly on the glass coffee table, breaking the quiet morning silence. It was Marcus, my highly trusted chief operating officer, and the only person who knew the full extent of my deep undercover operation. Good morning, Madam CEO, Marcus said, his voice filled with distinct professional satisfaction. The acquisition paperwork for the Northeast Development Group is officially complete. We now own a controlling 60% stake in the entire commercial block. However, we have a slight unexpected complication this morning. I grabbed my leather briefcase and headed toward the private elevator. Tell me everything, Marcus, I instructed, pressing the polished silver button for the lobby. Bradley Wilson just walked into our downtown corporate office, Marcus explained. He is completely frantic. He is currently begging the front desk receptionist for an emergency meeting with our senior investment board. He desperately needs a massive bridge loan to cover the $3 million shortfall in his corporate accounts before the federal authorities officially file the primary indictment at noon. He is offering his entire contracting firm as collateral. A cold, calculating smile touched my lips as the private elevator doors slid open. Keep him waiting in the primary glass conference room, Marcus, I ordered, stepping into the sleek mirrored compartment. Do not offer him coffee. Do not offer him water. Let him sweat under the bright lights. I am on my way down right now. I will handle this specific negotiation personally. Understood, Sydney, Marcus replied. The board members are already seated. We are ready for your grand entrance. I stepped out of the luxury high-rise building and slid directly into the waiting black town car. The busy Manhattan streets blurred past the tinted windows as we drove swiftly toward the financial district. Bradley was acting exactly as I had perfectly predicted. Like a drowning rat, he was frantically grasping at any available lifeline, completely unaware that I was the one holding the actual rope. He thought he could easily charm his way out of a massive federal crime by securing an emergency loan from a faceless venture capital firm. He had absolutely no idea that Horizon Digital was my company. The town car pulled up to the towering glass skyscraper that housed my corporate headquarters. I bypassed the main security desk with a simple nod to the guards and stepped into the private executive elevator. The quiet hum of the ascending car felt like the steady ticking clock counting down the final remaining minutes of Bradley's arrogant reign. I walked confidently down the pristine white hallway toward the main glass conference room. Through the transparent walls, I could clearly see Bradley pacing frantically back and forth across the gray carpet. His expensive custom suit was deeply wrinkled and his tie hung loosely around his neck. He was aggressively chewing his fingernails, completely consumed by total panic. Donovan sat tensely at the large mahogany table, desperately reviewing a stack of heavily redacted financial documents. I placed my hand firmly on the cold metal door handle and pushed it wide open to finally conclude this long overdue revenge. I did not step into that glass conference room. I let them sit there in my corporate headquarters, sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights, realizing just how thoroughly they were outmatched. After an hour of watching them panic through the transparent walls, I instructed Marcus to have security escort them out to the sidewalk. I sent a single text message to Bradley, confirming I would meet them at the downtown cafe on 5th Street at exactly noon, completely on my own terms. I arrived at the cafe 5 minutes early, stepping out of my town car, wearing a tailored midnight blue suit and dark sunglasses. I looked absolutely flawless, a sharp contrast to the two men waiting for me at a cramped corner table. Bradley looked like he had not slept in a week. His face was pale and covered in rough stubble. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around the room with paranoid intensity. Donovan sat beside him, tightly clutching a heavy leather briefcase, his usual arrogant swagger replaced by a tense, rigid posture. They looked entirely broken, yet they were still desperately clinging to the illusion of control. I pulled out a chair and sat across from them, signaling the waiter for a black coffee. I did not speak. I simply watched them squirm. Donovan was the first to break the silence. He unlatched his briefcase with trembling hands and pulled out a massive, heavily bound legal binder, slamming it down violently onto the center of the small wooden table. The loud thud caused several nearby patrons to turn and stare, but Donovan did not care. He leaned across the table, his face turning an ugly shade of red. "We have successfully forged hundreds of corporate emails, explicitly proving you orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme." Donovan hissed, his voice trembling with malicious intent. "We fabricated a perfect digital paper trail, showing you acting as the lead accountant, manipulating the ledgers and actively hiding the missing funds from Bradley. You are going to sign a full, legally binding confession right here, taking the absolute fall for everything. If you refuse, I will personally ensure the federal prosecutors see this binder, and I will make certain you spend 20 years in a maximum security federal prison." Bradley leaned in next to Donovan, trying desperately to summon his old domineering persona. "You thought you were so smart leaving me standing in the rain," Bradley snarled, his breath smelling of stale alcohol and fear. "But you are nothing against my family. We have connections you cannot even comprehend. You are going to take the blame for this, Sydney. You are going to tell the authorities that you stole the money because you were a bitter, greedy housewife. You will go to prison, and my reputation will remain spotless." I calmly picked up my coffee cup, taking a slow, measured sip. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I looked at the massive binder sitting between us, recognizing it for exactly what it was. It was a pathetic bluff from two men who had entirely lost their grip on reality. "You forged emails?" I asked, my voice carrying genuine amusement. You forged digital documents against a federal forensic investigator who specializes in digital footprint analysis. Do you truly understand how fast the FBI Cyber Division will tear apart your fabricated metadata, Donovan? It will take them less than 10 minutes to trace the IP addresses back to your personal laptop. Donovan swallowed hard, a bead of sweat slowly rolling down his temple. The legal threat was already falling apart, but I was not finished. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a single thin manila folder. I placed it gently on top of their massive, useless binder and slowly slid it across the table until it rested directly in front of Donovan. Before you boldly threaten me with 20 years in federal prison, Donovan, I said, leaning forward so my voice was dangerously quiet, maybe you should explain to your wife, Megan, why you have been systematically draining her inherited trust fund for the last 4 years. Donovan froze completely. All the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. Bradley looked between us, entirely confused by this sudden pivot. I tapped a manicured fingernail against the manila folder. You used Megan's family money to secretly purchase a $3 million luxury condo in Miami for a 22-year-old Instagram model, I stated with terrifying clarity. I have the bank statements, the property deeds, the flight records, and dozens of high-resolution photographs of the two of you together. For years, Donovan sat at Sunday dinners lecturing everyone about fiscal responsibility and traditional values. He degraded me for my salary while secretly bleeding his wife dry to fund a double life. You thought your shell companies were untraceable? I continued, my voice relentless. You used the same offshore routing techniques you used for Bradley's bribes. You handed me the map to your own destruction. I sent a duplicate copy of this folder to Megan via overnight courier. She is currently meeting with the most aggressive divorce attorney in the state, and she has fully authorized a forensic audit of your entire legal practice. Donovan physically recoiled as if he had been struck by lightning. His hands shook violently as he dropped his heavy leather briefcase onto the floor. The polished latches popped open, spilling useless legal documents across the cafe tiles. Bradley stared at his brother-in-law in absolute horror, realizing his brilliant legal protector was completely compromised and fundamentally useless. Before either man could formulate a single word of defense, the ambient noise of the busy city street was violently shattered. A chorus of sirens erupted from every direction. Red and blue lights flashed against the large glass windows of the cafe. 4 heavily armored police cruisers aggressively swerved onto the curb, completely surrounding the building and blocking all possible exits. The flashing red and blue lights painted the cafe in chaotic strokes of color. The screech of tires was immediately followed by the deafening sound of heavy boots slamming against the pavement. Through the storefront, I watched a dozen heavily armed tactical police officers pour out of armored vehicles. They moved with absolute military precision, carrying assault rifles and wearing thick black Kevlar vests. The casual morning crowd instantly erupted into total pandemonium. Patrons screamed in terror, knocking over lattes and dropping plates as they scrambled to get under tables. The baristas ducked behind the espresso machines, covering their heads. Donovan was frozen in his chair, his eyes bulging as he stared at the scattered, incriminating documents covering the floor around his expensive leather shoes. He looked completely paralyzed by the sudden show of state force. Bradley, however, experienced a distinctly different reaction. I watched the terror drain from his sweaty face, rapidly replaced by a sickeningly triumphant smirk. He glanced quickly at Donovan and then back at me, his chest puffing out with arrogance. In his narcissistic mind, he instantly concluded that Donovan had pulled a massive political string. He genuinely believed his corrupt lawyer had orchestrated a tactical raid to have me arrested for corporate espionage before I could expose their embezzlement ring. The heavy glass doors were violently yanked open. "Freeze and drop to the floor!" An imposing tactical commander bellowed, his voice amplified by a heavy megaphone. "Nobody moves a single inch. Keep your hands exactly where I can see them." The officers flooded the tight aisles, their boots crunching over spilled coffee and shattered glass. They moved with terrifying speed directly toward our corner table. Bradley sat back in his chair, casually crossing his arms over his chest, like a reigning king watching his executioner arrive. He actually managed a smug chuckle, fully expecting the officers to drag me away screaming. The tactical team converged on our small table. They completely bypassed Bradley, not even granting him a single glance. They ignored Donovan, who was hyperventilating and clutching his chest, as if experiencing a cardiac event. Instead, two massive officers stepped directly beside my chair. They grabbed my arms with firm, calculated force, hoisting me out of my seat before I could blink. They spun me around, pressing my chest firmly against the cool surface of the wooden table. The cold, heavy steel of tactical handcuffs snapped aggressively around my wrists, locking tightly into place with a sharp metallic click. Bradley stood up slowly, adjusting his wrinkled suit jacket with profound satisfaction. He walked over to where I was pinned against the table, ignoring the armed officers surrounding us. He leaned in so close that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. His eyes burned with a toxic mixture of intense hatred and absolute victory. "I told you," Bradley whispered, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. "I always win. Enjoy your new home, maid." I did not flinch. I did not struggle against the tight metal cuffs biting into my wrists. I slowly turned my head and stared directly into his bloodshot eyes. I kept my expression completely blank, offering him no reaction, no fear, and zero satisfaction. My icy, unfazed stare seemed to briefly unsettle him, causing his smug smile to falter for a mere fraction of a second before his massive ego compensated and rebuilt the arrogant facade. "Get her out of here!" the tactical commander barked, waving his heavy-gloved hand toward the exit. "Move out!" The two officers hauled me backward, pulling me away from the table. As they marched me aggressively through the center of the terrified cafe, I looked back one final time. Donovan was on his hands and knees, weeping openly as he frantically tried to gather the scattered documents exposing his illicit real estate purchases. Bradley was standing tall, practically glowing with pride, entirely convinced he had successfully outsmarted a federal investigator and saved his crumbling suburban empire. He had absolutely no idea that his entire reality was a carefully constructed mirage. The officers pushed me through the shattered front doors and out into the crisp morning air. The blinding sunlight hit my face, mixing with the aggressive strobe of the police cruisers blocking the busy intersection. Pedestrians had gathered behind yellow police tape, holding up cell phones to record the dramatic arrest of a woman in a midnight blue designer suit. I kept my head held high, maintaining my flawless posture as they marched me directly toward the largest armored cruiser parked at the very front of the barricade. One officer placed a heavy hand on top of my head, guiding me smoothly into the back seat of the dark vehicle. The heavy reinforced door slammed shut behind me instantly, cutting off the deafening noise of the blaring sirens and the shouting crowd. The thick, tinted windows plunged the back seat into cool, heavily isolated shadows. The chaotic spectacle outside was completely muted, leaving a heavy, ringing silence inside the secure vehicle. I sat still against the hard plastic seat, my hands bound tightly behind my back. The front doors of the cruiser opened simultaneously. The tactical commander slid into the driver's seat while the arresting officer who had pinned me to the table climbed into the passenger side. The doors slammed shut, sealing us inside the quiet, secure cabin. The arresting officer turned around to face me through the thick metal security grate. He reached through a small, sliding panel, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness. He slipped a small silver key into the steel handcuffs, turning it with a soft click. The metal cuffs fell away from my wrists instantly. I rubbed my skin, bringing my hands forward to rest comfortably on my lap. "Sorry for the theater, ma'am," the officer said, his voice devoid of the aggressive bark used inside the cafe. His tone was respectful, almost deferential. "The director is waiting for you at the safe house." The unmarked cruiser glided smoothly into the subterranean garage of a luxury building in Tribeca. The arresting officer led me up a private elevator to a high-end federal holding suite. This was no police station. There were no fluorescent lights, no steel bars, and no fingerprinting stations. Instead, I stepped into a sprawling penthouse converted into a secure command center. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the river, while advanced encrypted servers hummed quietly. A top-tier defense attorney sat at a massive conference table alongside Special Agent Vance, the FBI lead agent assigned to my specific operation. They were poring over towering stacks of financial documents and wire transfer records. I took a seat opposite Vance, pouring myself a glass of water. The extraction had gone flawlessly. The publicized arrest at the cafe was entirely theatrical, designed specifically to isolate Bradley while ensuring my absolute safety. I was not a suspect. I was an officially protected federal whistleblower. The tactical raid worked perfectly, Vance noted, sliding a classified dossier toward me. Donovan left his briefcase on the floor. Our cyber division already seized it along with his personal laptop. We have his forged emails, but they mean absolutely nothing. I nodded calmly. Donovan underestimated the timeline. He thought he could pressure me into signing a confession before the Bureau moved. He had no idea I submitted 5,000 pages of Bradley's racketeering evidence to your field office 3 weeks ago. Vance chuckled, shaking his head as he reviewed my flawless digital paper trail. He really thought you were just his bookkeeper. He didn't realize you're a certified forensic investigator who took down the Martinez cartel 3 years ago. Arrogance is a dangerous blind spot, I replied, leaning back. Bradley assumed my entire existence revolved around organizing his receipts. He never questioned my background because narcissists never look beyond their own reflection. The defense attorney tapped his pen against an indictment. The grand jury signed off an hour ago. We have authorization to freeze every single corporate and personal account linked to Bradley. The financial web is dismantled. Before I could respond, the secure radio on Vance's belt crackled sharply to life. The frantic voice of a surveillance operative filled the quiet room. Agent Vance, we have visual confirmation. Bradley is making a run for it. He's trying to clear out the mansion's safe. Vance grabbed the radio, his expression hardening instantly. Confirm his passengers. He has Logan and Mackenzie in the vehicle. They are heading north on the interstate at dangerous speeds. They are making a desperate play for the suburban property. I stood up, walking toward the large glass windows. Bradley was functioning on pure adrenaline. He knew his accounts were frozen and his lawyer was compromised. His final lifeline was the massive hidden safe located behind the custom mahogany bookshelf in his home office. Across the city, Bradley was rapidly losing his grip on reality. He gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. He swerved violently through heavy morning traffic, entirely ignoring stoplights. In the passenger seat, Logan was gripping the dashboard, his face pale with panicked sweat. In the back seat, Mackenzie was hyperventilating. Bradley was consumed by a singular, frantic objective. He needed to reach the suburban mansion, access the hidden safe, grab the stack of unregistered gold bars, secure their passports, and flee the country. "Slow down, Dad," Logan shouted, bracing himself as the vehicle took a hard corner. "You are going to get us killed." "Shut up," Bradley roared, his voice cracking with feral desperation. "Your massive gambling debt started this entire chain reaction. If we do not get to that wall safe right now, we are going to spend our lives in federal prison. Sydney set us up." Mackenzie wailed loudly from the back seat, tears streaming down her face. "My entire life is completely ruined. What about my designer bags? What about my jewelry?" Bradley ignored his daughter's complaints, slamming his foot on the accelerator. The familiar tree-lined streets of their upscale neighborhood finally came into view. The sprawling, meticulously landscaped property sat at the end of a private cul-de-sac, a monument to his stolen wealth. He sped up the street, intending to blow right through the open driveway and park directly at the front door. However, as the vehicle approached the property line, Bradley was forced to slam violently on the brakes. The heavy tires screeched against the asphalt, leaving thick, black marks as the SUV skidded to a sudden halt. The massive iron driveway gates, which were always kept wide open during the day, were pulled tightly shut. They were secured and padlocked with heavy industrial steel chains. Bradley sat frozen in the driver's seat, his eyes staring at the heavy metal barricade. This was his sanctuary, his fortress, his kingdom. Without thinking, Bradley threw the vehicle into park and jumped out, leaving the driver door wide open. He sprinted toward the iron gates, grabbing the metal bars and shaking them with all of his remaining strength. The heavy chains rattled loudly, but the reinforced gates did not budge a single inch. Inside the vehicle, Mackenzie was hysterically crying about her clothes. Logan kicked the passenger door open, aggressively cursing at the locked gates. Suddenly, the heavy oak front door of the mansion swung wide open. A private security team dressed in dark tactical gear stepped out from the shadows of the sprawling front porch. They moved with calm, disciplined authority, walking straight down the long paved driveway toward the locked iron gates. The team leader stopped just on the other side of the metal bars, staring blankly at the frantic, sweating man shaking the iron. "Get off the property!" the team leader commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Bradley gripped the metal bars tightly, his face twisting into a mask of pure rage as he violently spat his response. "I own this house! I built it!" The echo of Bradley's desperate scream hung in the crisp morning air, clashing against the imposing stone facade of the sprawling suburban mansion. He violently rattled the heavy wrought iron gates again, his knuckles turning stark white from the immense pressure. The thick metal chains holding the barricade shut clanked loudly, mocking his frantic display of ownership. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life controlling every single variable and dominating every room he entered. Now he was locked out of his own fortress, reduced to throwing a pathetic temper tantrum on the concrete driveway, while his spoiled children wailed in the idling luxury vehicle behind him. The private security team leader did not flinch at the aggressive outburst. He was a towering, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark tactical uniform lacking any recognizable corporate insignias. He stepped forward with calm, calculated precision, stopping just inches from the opposite side of the iron bars. His face remained completely impassive, an impenetrable mask of professional indifference that only served to fuel Bradley's escalating rage. "I demand that you open these gates right this second!" Bradley snarled, his voice cracking wildly as spit flew from his lips. "I am Bradley Wilson. I commissioned the architectural blueprints for this property. I picked out the custom Italian marble in that foyer. I paid for the imported slate on that roof. You are standing on my private land, and I will have you all arrested for criminal trespassing." The security leader reached slowly inside his tactical vest. He did not pull a weapon. Instead, he produced a crisp, thick manila envelope. He withdrew a single legally bound document featuring a raised golden notary seal. The paper looked incredibly heavy, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. "You own absolutely nothing, Mr. Wilson." The security leader stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried perfectly over the sound of Mackenzie's loud sobbing from the nearby car. The leader smoothly slid the notarized deed through the narrow gap between the cold iron bars. Bradley snatched the paper aggressively from the man's gloved hand, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He held the document up to the morning light, his bloodshot eyes frantically scanning the dense legal jargon filling the pages. He was desperately searching for a loophole, a clerical error, or any tiny mistake he could exploit to regain control of his crumbling empire. "You defaulted on your shadow mortgages 2 years ago," the guard stated, delivering the devastating facts with surgical precision. "You secretly leveraged this estate to the absolute limit to cover the staggering losses from your commercial development failures. When you stopped making the required balloon payments, the primary lender quietly auctioned the debt to avoid a highly publicized foreclosure scandal." Bradley's hands began to violently shake. The expensive paper crinkled loudly between his trembling fingers. The confident, arrogant swagger that had defined his entire existence was completely evaporating, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. He tried to speak, to formulate a coherent legal defense, but his throat was entirely dry. "A private equity firm named SA Holdings bought the deed completely in cash," the guard continued, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "They purchased the primary mortgage, the secondary liens, and the total property rights. You have been living here solely by the grace of the new owner. She allowed you to maintain the pathetic illusion of your wealth while she meticulously finalized the remaining corporate acquisitions. And she has formally evicted you as of exactly 8 this morning. Logan kicked the passenger side door of the luxury SUV, storming out onto the driveway. "What is he talking about, Dad?" Logan yelled, pointing an accusatory finger at the security team. "Tell them to get off our lawn. I have 3 duffel bags of designer clothes and my vintage watch collection inside that house. I need to get into my bedroom right now." Mackenzie stumbled out of the back seat, her high heels twisting awkwardly on the concrete. "My entire life is in there," she screamed, mascara running darkly down her cheeks. "My jewelry, my bags, my safe. You promised we were just grabbing our passports and leaving. You promised we were going to the private jet. Fix this right now." Bradley could not hear his children. Their selfish, demanding voices faded into meaningless background static. His entire focus was locked onto the boldly printed black ink at the very bottom of the notarized deed. His eyes darted back and forth across the signature line, trying desperately to process the impossible reality staring back at him. The security leader took one deliberate step closer to the iron gate, ensuring his final words landed with maximum destructive impact. "Any attempt to breach this perimeter will be treated as a hostile intrusion. The local police department has already been provided with the updated property deeds and the active eviction notices. If you attempt to climb this fence, we will physically restrain you and hand you directly over to the federal agents who are currently en route to your location." Bradley stared at the heavily bolded letters on the bottom of the page. S.A. Holdings. The initials burned into his retinas. He traced the letters repeatedly with his eyes. S.A. Sydney. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The quiet, submissive woman he had relentlessly mocked and degraded for years was the brilliant architect of his total destruction. She had not simply exposed his massive embezzlement scheme. She had systematically purchased the very ground beneath his feet. She had owned the roof over his head while allowing him to demand she clean the floors. She possessed the hidden safe, the unregistered gold bars, the passports, and every single material item his spoiled children valued. The document slipped from his numb fingers, fluttering softly against the iron gate before landing on the ground. His knees buckled. The strength vanished from his legs, sending him crashing down hard onto the unforgiving concrete driveway. The cold, unyielding concrete of the driveway scraped against Bradley's knees, but he barely registered the physical pain. His mind was paralyzed by the magnitude of his absolute defeat. Sydney, the woman he treated as a disposable pawn, had dismantled his entire empire directly under his nose. She owned the mansion. She owned the ground he was kneeling on. The private security leader did not offer any pity. He stepped forward, heavy boots crunching on the driveway, and delivered his final warning. He gave them exactly 2 minutes to vacate the premises before calling federal authorities. Mackenzie wailed hysterically tightly, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver. Logan kicked the luxury vehicle's tires, screaming loud profanities into the morning air. Bradley hoisted himself up his limbs, feeling like lead, and stumbled to the driver's seat. He turned the ignition, his hands violently shaking, and reversed out of the private driveway that no longer belonged to him. Their options were entirely gone. Every single bank account was currently frozen. Their credit cards were instantly declined when Bradley attempted to purchase bottled water at a local gas station. With absolutely zero cash and federal authorities tracking their movements, they had one desperate destination left. Bradley navigated the vehicle toward Donovan's modest suburban townhouse. Donovan was already in sheer panic, having fled the chaotic cafe raid on foot before federal agents could process him. When Bradley aggressively pounded on the front door, Donovan's wife Megan answered with profound disgust. Seeing him standing on her small porch completely ruined was a bitter pill she swallowed. Donovan dragged them inside constantly, peeking through the living room blinds, terrified an FBI cruiser would pull up to the curb. The cramped environment immediately bred a suffocating tension. The townhouse was incredibly small, and Bradley, Logan, and Mackenzie were forced to share a single guest room smelling faintly of old carpet. Mackenzie collapsed onto the narrow twin bed, sobbing about the loss of her massive, expansive closet, while Bradley paced the tight floorboards like a caged animal. The sheer lack of space was agonizing, but it was Logan who finally broke the fragile peace. He paced the living room violently, tapping his smartphone screen. He aggressively attempted to access his offshore trust fund accounts, desperately trying to wire funds to a prepaid card. Every single attempt was met with the exact same flashing red notification stating his access was denied and the assets were frozen by federal mandate. Logan was rapidly spiraling into severe chemical withdrawal. His skin was pale and slick with cold sweat, his hands trembling violently. He needed cash to feed his escalating drug habit, and the sudden realization that his endless supply of illicit funds had completely evaporated sent him into a blind, destructive rage. "Give me some cash," Logan demanded, cornering his father near the small dining table. "I need money right now." "I have nothing," Bradley hissed, keeping his voice low to avoid alerting Donovan. "Every account is locked. Sydney took everything. You need to calm down." "Calm down!" Logan screamed, his voice shattering the quiet house. "You told me we were untouchable. You told me my trust fund was secure." Logan spun around, his frantic eyes landing on a decorative display shelf in the corner of the living room. Before Bradley could stop him, Logan lunged toward the shelf, grabbing one of Megan's prized antique porcelain vases. He raised it high above his head and hurled it violently against the hardwood floor. The expensive ceramic shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces with an explosive crash. He did not stop there. He grabbed a second vase, roaring with pure fury, and smashed it directly against the drywall, leaving a deep, devastating gouge in the plaster. The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the entire house, instantly drawing Megan from the kitchen. She stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she stared at the destroyed heirlooms covering her living room floor. Her face flushed with an intense, fiery rage. "Are you insane?" Megan shrieked, marching aggressively toward Bradley. She pointed a shaking finger directly at his chest. "Control your golden boy. Sydney used to clean up his messes, but she isn't here anymore. You are guests in my home, and you will not destroy it because you cannot handle the consequences of your own pathetic actions." Bradley stepped backward, raising his hands in a futile attempt to pacify her. He had spent his entire life commanding respect, but in that cramped, destroyed living room, he possessed absolutely zero authority. He grabbed Logan by the collar of his expensive shirt and shoved him roughly back into the tiny guest room, slamming the door shut to cut off Megan's furious screaming. Inside the stifling room, Bradley shoved his son against the wall, his eyes wild with desperate calculation. The federal authorities had their financial records. Sydney possessed the physical deeds. The legal system was completely turned against them. But Bradley realized they still possessed one single weapon they could weaponize against her. "We are going to destroy her," Bradley whispered frantically, gripping Logan's shoulders tightly. "If we have no money, we use the court of public opinion. We paint Sydney as a manipulative criminal mastermind who defrauded her loving family and stole our legacy. We drag her name through the mud until the pressure forces her to settle and release our frozen assets." Logan finally stopped shaking, a dark, manic gleam suddenly igniting in his bloodshot eyes. He wiped the cold sweat from his pale forehead and slowly nodded in total agreement. He stepped away from his father and grabbed a portable ring light that Megan kept for her video calls. He carefully set it up in the dark corner of the cramped guest room, the bright circular bulb casting harsh shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Logan mounted his smartphone onto the center bracket, adjusted the camera angle to perfectly capture his distressed, exhausted face, and confidently hit record. The harsh glare of the ring light illuminated Logan and Mackenzie as they sat shoulder to shoulder on the edge of the narrow twin bed. Logan meticulously framed the shot to make the cramped guest room look as pathetic and destitute as possible. He chose an angle highlighting the peeling wallpaper and cracked window blind. Mackenzie rubbed off her makeup, leaving just enough mascara smudged beneath her eyes to create the perfect illusion of recent heartbreak. She wore an oversized faded gray sweatshirt, instead of her usual designer brands, pulling the sleeves over her knuckles to look smaller and more vulnerable. Logan tapped the record button on his smartphone screen. Instantly, Mackenzie buried her face in her hands, letting out a perfectly rehearsed sob. Logan wrapped a protective arm around her trembling shoulders, looking directly into the lens with wide, pleading eyes. "Hi, everyone." Logan started, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. "We did not want to make this video. We are so scared and do not know what to do. My name is Logan, and this is my sister Mackenzie. Until yesterday, we had a normal, happy family. But our stepmother, Sydney, planned an illegal takeover of our lives. She is a criminal mastermind who defrauded our father and stole our family legacy." Mackenzie looked up at the camera, her lower lip quivering as a single manufactured tear rolled down her cheek. "She threw us onto the street with absolutely nothing," she whimpered, wiping her face with her oversized sleeve. "She froze all of our accounts. She took our home. She took my clothes. She took everything my father worked his life to build. We are innocent teenagers left completely homeless, sleeping in a tiny room because she wanted to steal our father's money to fund her lavish lifestyle. She is an abusive, gold-digging monster who destroyed us just for greed." Logan leaned closer to the lens, his face a mask of desperate sincerity. "Please share this video. We need the world to know who Sydney really is. We need help to get our lives back before she destroys our father." He reached forward and stopped the recording. The instant the screen went black, Mackenzie stopped crying. Her posture straightened, and the vulnerability vanished. She snatched the phone from the tripod, her manicured fingers flying across the screen to apply a heavy desaturated filter, making the footage look even more grim and depressing. She uploaded the edited file to every major social platform, tagging local news outlets, gossip channels, and influencers known for spotlighting family drama. The digital explosion was instantaneous and catastrophic. Within 3 hours, the video crossed 500,000 views. By noon, it surpassed 2 million. The internet mob latched onto the narrative of the evil stepmother terrorizing two innocent, displaced youths. The comment sections transformed into a rabid echo chamber of pure vitriol, demanding immediate justice for Logan and Mackenzie. 8. The devastating real-world consequences of the viral smear campaign crashed into Sydney's professional life with terrifying speed. At her private forensic accounting firm in the financial district, the phone lines began ringing relentlessly. The receptionist was overwhelmed by a barrage of aggressive calls. People screamed profanities, hurling graphic death threats at the staff and demanding Sydney face immediate imprisonment. The firm's public email inbox flooded with thousands of hateful messages within a matter of hours. Worse than the public harassment was the swift corporate fallout. 4 of Sydney's major clients, terrified of the negative public relations associating their brands with a viral scandal, abruptly pulled their highly lucrative contracts. The carefully constructed professional reputation Sydney had built over a decade was suddenly actively burning to the ground, based entirely on a 2-minute fictional performance. Back at the cramped townhouse, the atmosphere had shifted from suffocating tension to euphoric celebration. Bradley and Donovan sat at the tiny dining table, huddled around a sleek laptop screen. The monitor's glow reflected in Bradley's eyes as he watched the view count on Logan's video climb higher by the second. The number ticked past 3 million. Donovan threw his head back and laughed, a loud, booming sound of absolute triumph. He clapped Bradley hard on the shoulder, pointing excitedly at the rising engagement metrics and the thousands of furious comments tearing Sydney apart. "Look at this," Donovan cheered, his chest puffing out with overwhelming arrogance. "The court of public opinion will ruin her faster than the FBI can protect her. She is losing clients by the hour. Her reputation is completely annihilated. By tomorrow morning, she will be begging us for a compromise. She will have to settle the civil suits and unfreeze your accounts to stop the bleeding." Bradley leaned back in his chair, a deeply sinister smile stretching across his face. The paralyzing terror he had felt on the concrete driveway had evaporated. He felt powerful again. He felt like the predator he always knew he was. He truly believed he had successfully weaponized the public to destroy the woman who had dared to challenge his authority. Miles away, high above the chaotic city streets, Sydney sat alone in the quiet luxury of her expansive penthouse. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the skyline, but her full attention was focused on the large monitor on her glass desk. She was actively watching Logan and Mackenzie's tear-filled video. She listened to their vicious lies. She saw the terrifying death threats scrolling rapidly across the comment section. She watched her firm's public rating plummet as Vigilante's review bombed her business pages. She did not panic. She did not cry. Her breathing remained perfectly steady, and her expression was entirely devoid of fear or anxiety. She reached into the bottom drawer of her desk and retrieved a heavy encrypted external hard drive. She placed the device on the desk. A small white label was affixed to the top of the silver casing. It read "Mansion Hidden Cams" in crisp black ink. The silver casing of the encrypted hard drive gleamed under the soft glow of her desk lamp. Sydney calmly plugged the device into her secure terminal. A password prompt appeared on the high-definition monitor. She typed in a 50-character alphanumeric sequence with rapid practice keystrokes. The progress bar flashed green, granting her full access to terabytes of pristine, unedited reality. Her personal smartphone vibrated continuously against the glass desktop. The caller ID flashed the name of her crisis management public relations team. They had been bombarding her with frantic text messages for the past 4 hours. Her lead publicist, a seasoned veteran of corporate scandals, had sent a dozen drafts of a standard public apology. The proposed statements were full of weak, passive language begging the public for patience while promising a thorough internal review. The legal team had also chimed in, urging her to issue a sweeping cease and desist order to force the video offline. Sydney deleted the PR drafts with a single click. She had absolutely no intention of playing defense. Issuing an apology would signal guilt. Sending a cease and desist would validate their fabricated narrative and make her look like a terrified coward desperately trying to silence 2 innocent youths. She operated on a completely different battlefield. When an enemy controls the narrative, you do not politely ask them to stop. You obliterate their credibility with absolute undeniable proof. She pressed a button on her desk console connecting directly to her firm's chief technology officer. She instructed him to bypass the standard corporate firewall and establish a maximum capacity, high-definition, public Zoom webinar. She wanted 0 restrictions on attendee numbers. She wanted the chat function left wide open and entirely unmoderated. She wanted every single person who had watched Logan's pathetic, tear-filled performance to have a front-row seat to her response. Within 20 minutes, the digital infrastructure was primed and ready. Sydney drafted a brief, razor-sharp email. The subject line read, "The absolute truth regarding the Wilson estate." The body contained nothing but the time of the broadcast and the direct Zoom link. She instructed her team to blast the email to every major national news outlet, local investigative journalist and financial blogger who had covered the viral smear campaign. She forwarded the link directly to her alienated clients, the corporate boards who had hastily canceled her contracts, and the private investors who were currently demanding answers. Finally, she copied the entire extended Wilson family directory. She included the aunts, uncles, cousins, and distant relatives who had spent the morning sending her vitriolic text messages. She wanted every single person who had blindly swallowed Bradley's manufactured victimhood to witness the incoming destruction. Across the city, inside Donovan's cramped suburban townhouse, the atmosphere of victorious celebration reached a fever pitch. Bradley sat at the tiny dining table clutching a glass of cheap whiskey when the email notification popped up on Logan's smartphone. Logan burst into a fit of arrogant laughter, tossing the phone onto the table for his father to see. Bradley read the subject line, a dark, triumphant grin splitting his face. He genuinely believed his psychological warfare had worked flawlessly. In his deeply narcissistic mind, Sydney was a broken, terrified woman. He assumed she was about to log on to a public forum to beg for mercy, surrender her assets, and publicly apologize to save her rapidly collapsing accounting firm. He thought she was officially raising the white flag. "Get in here," Bradley shouted toward the tiny guest room. "She is cracking. She is doing a live broadcast to apologize. We're going to watch her completely humiliate herself." Mackenzie and Donovan crowded around the laptop screen as Bradley clicked the meeting link. The webinar waiting room was already exploding with activity. The attendee counter skyrocketed past 50,000 viewers in a matter of minutes. Journalists, angry internet vigilantes, and corporate executives were all flooding into the digital arena. Logan immediately opened the unmoderated chat window. His fingers flew across the keyboard, typing a barrage of smug, taunting comments. He demanded she return his stolen trust fund. He called her a coward. Mackenzie leaned over his shoulder, gleefully dictating more insults to flood the scrolling chat feed. They felt entirely untouchable, surrounded by an invisible army of internet supporters who had validated their victimhood all morning. At exactly 3 in the afternoon, the digital waiting room vanished. The screen transitioned from black to a crystal-clear high-definition live feed. Sydney sat dead center in the frame. She did not look like a woman on the verge of a breakdown. She wore a tailored crimson power suit, her posture immaculate, and her expression completely devoid of fear, stress, or intimidation. She looked entirely lethal. The chat window accelerated into a blur of rapid-fire text as thousands of angry viewers hurled insults, demanding she apologize to the displaced teenagers. Logan typed furiously, claiming she was a monster. Sydney did not blink. She ignored the scrolling vitriol completely. Her sharp, calculating eyes stared directly into the camera lens, piercing through the digital divide. The sheer intensity of her silent glare caused the chaotic chat feed to noticeably slow down. The viewers were expecting a weeping, apologetic woman holding a prepared statement. Instead, they were staring at an apex predator perfectly comfortable in her domain. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the glass desk. When she finally spoke, her voice was smooth, resonant, and entirely stripped of any emotional vulnerability. It was the calm, terrifying tone of a forensic investigator about to present undeniable evidence to a grand jury. Yesterday, my stepchildren claimed I destroyed their family. Sydney stated, her words ringing with absolute razor-sharp clarity. Today I am going to show you who they really are. Without breaking her intense, intimidating gaze with the camera lens, Sydney moved her right hand to her computer mouse. She navigated the cursor across her secondary monitor. Sydney clicked Share Screen. The high-definition feed on the Zoom webinar shifted instantly. Sydney's stern face vanished, replaced by crisp, full-color security footage. The glowing digital timestamp indicated a Tuesday afternoon from exactly 7 months prior. The camera angle provided a sweeping, unobstructed view of Bradley's opulent master bedroom. The massive mahogany king bed and custom silk drapery were absolutely unmistakable. The thousands of viewers, including major journalists and furious internet vigilantes, sat in total digital silence. The chaotic chat feed slowed to a crawl as the stunned audience desperately tried to process exactly what they were watching. The heavy, solid oak door to the master suite slowly creaked open. Logan quietly slipped inside. He wore the exact same faded gray sweatshirt he had worn in his tearful victim video just hours earlier. However, there was no manufactured sadness on his face now. His features were tightly twisted in a frantic, desperate sweat. He moved with the erratic, twitchy energy of a severe addict, experiencing chemical withdrawal. In his right hand, he tightly gripped a heavy steel pry bar. He bypassed the expensive electronics and designer watches scattered across the room, heading straight for the walk-in closet. Logan dropped to his knees in the closet, dragging a rug aside to reveal a floor safe. Bradley had boasted about his security systems, but he underestimated his son. Logan wedged the flat edge of the pry bar directly into the digital keypad housing. He threw his body weight against the tool. The metal groaned under the pressure. He violently wrenched the bar back and forth until the lock shattered, exposing the internal mechanism. With the lock destroyed, Logan produced a battery-powered grinding tool. He jammed the spinning blade directly into the exposed tumblers. Sparks flew across the carpeting. It took him less than 4 minutes to bypass his father's security. The heavy steel door popped open. Logan dove inside the safe. He tossed aside thick stacks of sensitive corporate documents and bundles of emergency cash. He was focused solely on the velvet-lined lockbox sitting at the bottom. He ripped the lockbox open. The security camera captured the brilliant sparkle of the contents. Inside rested a stunning vintage diamond collar necklace, and matching chandelier earrings. They were irreplaceable family heirlooms belonging to Logan and Mackenzie's late biological mother. Bradley had kept them locked away, saving them for his daughter's eventual wedding day. Logan did not display a single ounce of hesitation or sentimental remorse. He aggressively grabbed the priceless diamonds, shoving them carelessly into his sweatshirt pocket. He kicked the destroyed safe door shut, pulled the rug back into place, and sprinted out of the master suite. The Zoom webinar broadcast smoothly transitioned to a second camera angle. This footage originated from a concealed lens hidden inside the living room chandelier. The timestamp showed it was exactly 12 minutes after the bedroom theft. The grand front doors of the mansion swung open. Logan ushered a tall, heavily tattooed man inside. The visitor wore a thick leather jacket and kept checking his surroundings with sharp, paranoid movements. Sydney's high-definition audio captured the entire exchange with terrifying clarity. Logan reached into his sweatshirt pocket and pulled out the velvet boxes. He flipped them open, exposing the dazzling diamond heirlooms to the harsh foyer lighting. The tattooed man pulled a jeweler's loop from his jacket, inspecting the stones with professional efficiency. He nodded once, a grim smile crossing his face. He shoved the diamonds into his jacket and handed Logan 2 thick vacuum-sealed plastic bags filled with a crystalline substance. Logan snatched the bags aggressively, his hands shaking with frantic anticipation. The drug dealer turned and exited the mansion, leaving Logan alone in the grand foyer clutching his illicit purchase. Sydney's voice cut through the broadcast. Her tone was sharp, icy, and entirely devoid of mercy. It echoed through the speakers of thousands of viewers, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute truth. Logan didn't drop out of college because of his abusive stepmother. Sydney stated, her voice slicing through the digital silence like a scalpel. He was expelled for dealing narcotics funded by stealing his dead mother's jewelry, which Bradley blamed on the cleaning staff. She paused, allowing the brutal reality to fully sink into the minds of the journalists and investors watching. When Bradley discovered the safe had been breached and the heirlooms were missing, he refused to suspect his golden boy. Sydney continued, her voice dripping with lethal precision. Instead, Bradley called the police and falsely accused our lead housekeeper, Maria. He had an innocent woman, a mother of 3, arrested and deported simply to protect his son's reputation. He destroyed a working-class family to cover up Logan's felonies. The unmoderated chat window on the Zoom call suddenly exploded into pure, unadulterated chaos. The thousands of viewers who had spent the entire morning demanding Sydney's imprisonment instantly turned their righteous fury onto Logan. The comments flew by at a blinding speed. Journalists frantically demanded statements from local police departments regarding the falsely accused housekeeper. Investors typed furious messages threatening immediate legal action against Bradley for harboring a dangerous criminal. The fabricated narrative of the innocent, displaced teenagers was completely obliterated, replaced by the devastating reality of a toxic criminal family. On the busy grid of participant webcams, one small video feed clearly stood out. Bradley sat completely frozen in the cramped suburban townhouse, his face rapidly drained of all color. His jaw hung totally slack as he watched the irrefutable evidence of his son's massive betrayal broadcast live to the entire world. The devastating truth hit him with the undeniable force of a freight train. He slowly turned his head, staring directly at Logan with a toxic mixture of absolute horror and boiling rage. Realizing that his entire public defense was thoroughly destroyed, and his own son was the architect of his final humiliation, Bradley let out a visceral, guttural scream. He reached up, grabbed his heavy headset with both hands, and violently ripped it off his head. The violent motion of Bradley ripping his headset off echoed through the live audio feed, a sharp burst of static that briefly overpowered the scrolling chat window. Sydney did not flinch. She watched the miniature video square displaying Donovan's cramped guest room with total detachment. Bradley was shaking, his face contorted in a mask of absolute horror and betrayal as he stared at his son. Logan shrank back against the peeling wallpaper, the arrogance he displayed just minutes earlier, completely vaporized by the irrefutable evidence of his crimes. Sydney allowed the silence to stretch, ensuring the gravity of the revelation saturated the minds of the viewers watching the broadcast. She had systematically dismantled the golden boy. Now it was time to address the weeping daughter. Sydney smoothly moved her cursor across her primary monitor. She clicked to open a secondary screen share. The brutal security footage of Logan vanished instantly, replaced by a stark, highly detailed financial dashboard. At the very top of the screen, she projected the exact GoFundMe campaign page that Mackenzie had frantically launched earlier that morning. The campaign was titled, "Help Innocent Siblings Survive Stepmother's Cruelty." The donation counter sat at a staggering $50,000, funded by sympathetic strangers who had watched Mackenzie cry on camera. The chat window briefly paused as viewers tried to understand the new graphic. Several journalists typed quick questions asking if Sydney was attempting to seize the donated charity funds. Sydney ignored the text. She typed a command into her terminal, and the static image of the GoFundMe page split in half. The right side of the screen populated with a complex web of banking routing numbers, IP addresses, and encrypted wire transfers. Sydney highlighted a string of transactions originating from the exact moment the charity campaign crossed the threshold. Many of you watching this broadcast generously opened your wallets today, Sydney stated, her voice projecting a chilling calm. You believed you were helping a displaced, terrified young woman secure housing and food. You thought your donations were going toward a noble cause, manipulated by a perfectly executed performance. I am displaying the back-end routing of those exact funds right now. I want you to look very closely at where your charity is actually going. Sydney clicked a red highlighted box on the financial tracking map. The data expanded, showing the money leaving the domestic crowdfunding platform. It did not route to a local bank account. It did not go toward a temporary housing rental or a grocery store. The tracking software illuminated the funds bouncing rapidly through 3 different shell companies in less than 10 minutes. The money crossed state lines, tumbled through a decentralized cryptocurrency exchange, and deposited directly into an illegal offshore digital casino. In the small video feed from the townhouse, Mackenzie let out a sharp, panicked gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in absolute terror. The oversized gray sweatshirt she wore to project vulnerability suddenly looked like a prison uniform. Mackenzie isn't a homeless victim, Sydney stated calmly, staring directly into the camera lens. She is a compulsive gambler who just committed wire fraud across state lines. The chat window erupted into absolute pandemonium. Individuals who had donated their money began demanding immediate refunds, typing furious messages about contacting the authorities. Mackenzie had actively defrauded the public. Sydney pulled up a secondary document, layering it over the financial tracking map. It was a comprehensive ledger of Mackenzie's digital footprint over the past 18 months. It detailed hundreds of thousands of dollars in gambling losses, all secretly covered by Bradley's rapidly depleting corporate accounts before Sydney had officially frozen them. While Bradley was busy blaming his failing business on market fluctuations, his daughter was systematically draining the company's cash reserves to feed a severe offshore gambling addiction. Sydney continued, her tone relentless and precise. When I locked the accounts this morning to preserve the remaining assets, she lost her lifeline. That viral video was never about securing a place to sleep. It was a highly calculated, desperate attempt to defraud sympathetic citizens to pay off her mounting illicit debts. Inside the townhouse, the remaining shreds of Bradley's sanity completely shattered. He had just watched his son steal his late wife's diamonds to buy narcotics, and now he was watching his daughter get exposed for committing federal wire fraud. He spun around, grabbing Mackenzie by the shoulders. He shook her violently, his face turning a dangerous crimson. Mackenzie shrieked, trying to push him away, stammering incoherent excuses about needing the money to win back what she had already lost. Logan remained frozen in the corner. Donovan pushed his way into the camera view. His face was slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He looked wildly around his own living room, realizing the catastrophic reality of his situation. He was harboring active fugitives who had just been exposed for federal crimes on a live broadcast monitored by investigative journalists and government agencies. His association with Bradley was no longer just a financial liability. It was an immediate criminal risk. Donovan lunged toward the laptop, his hands shaking as he desperately reached for the power button to kill the feed. But before his fingers could make contact with the keyboard, a new sound pierced the audio channel. It did not come from Sydney's penthouse. It bled through Donovan's unmuted microphone, faint at first, then rapidly growing louder and more distinct. It was the sharp, piercing wail of approaching sirens. The high-pitched rhythmic screaming of multiple police cruisers echoed through the suburban neighborhood, cutting through the thin drywall of the townhouse. The sound grew deafening, bouncing off the surrounding houses and filling the cramped guest room with the undeniable noise of incoming authorities. Sydney leaned back in her leather chair, her expression serene. She watched the panic completely overtake the faces on her monitor, letting the approaching sirens serve as the ultimate conclusion to her broadcast. The piercing wail of the sirens outside Donovan's cramped suburban townhouse reached a deafening crescendo before abruptly cutting off, replaced by the aggressive squeal of heavy tires skidding to a halt on the pavement. Through the thin, cheap blinds of the living room window, violently flashing red and blue strobe lights painted the walls in chaotic, strobing colors. The digital audience watching the unmoderated Zoom broadcast collectively held their breath. The scrolling chat window completely froze. 50,000 viewers, journalists, corporate executives, and formerly sympathetic internet vigilantes were now glued to their screens, watching the real-time destruction of Bradley Wilson's fabricated empire. Inside the townhouse, absolute panic consumed the room. Donovan abandoned his desperate attempt to shut down the laptop. He scrambled backward, tripping over the power cord and sending the computer spinning on the dining table, the webcam perfectly angling toward the front entryway. Mackenzie pressed her back against the peeling wallpaper of the guest room, her hands covering her mouth as she hyperventilated in pure terror. Logan darted his eyes wildly around the confined space, like a cornered animal searching for an impossible exit. Bradley remained paralyzed in his chair, his face entirely drained of blood, a man watching his entire reality disintegrate before his very eyes. Heavy, synchronized footsteps pounded up the exterior wooden stairs. Then came a booming voice demanding immediate compliance. Before Donovan could even take a step toward the entryway, a massive steel-toed tactical boot slammed into the front door. The cheap wooden frame violently splintered. The deadbolt completely sheared off the doorframe, sending jagged shards of wood flying across the cheap laminate flooring. The door crashed open with explosive force, slamming against the interior wall. A highly coordinated squad of heavily armed tactical police officers flooded into the tiny living room, their tactical flashlights cutting through the dim lighting. The lead officer immediately locked his sights on Logan. The golden boy who had wept about being a displaced victim just hours earlier panicked. He made a sudden, erratic dart toward the sliding glass patio door in the back. He did not make it 2 steps. 2 heavily armored officers lunged forward, hitting Logan with the force of a freight train. They tackled him brutally to the ground. The physical impact shook the entire townhouse, rattling the laptop on the table and sending a loud, percussive thud through the live audio feed. Logan thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities and kicking his legs, but the officers easily overpowered his chemically weakened frame. They pinned his shoulders to the floor, sharply twisting his arms behind his back. The distinct metallic click of heavy handcuffs locking into place echoed perfectly over the broadcast. The arresting officer loudly read the charges, citing felony narcotics distribution, grand larceny, and possession of stolen property. Logan sobbed, his face pressed hard against the dusty laminate flooring. Across the room, Mackenzie shrieked in absolute hysteria. She tried to wedge herself behind Donovan's cheap microfiber sofa, screaming that she was a victim, claiming she had absolutely no idea what was happening. A female officer swiftly grabbed her by the arm, dragging her out from her hiding spot. Mackenzie kicked and flailed, demanding they let her go, shrieking about her viral internet fame. The officer slammed Mackenzie against the wall, effortlessly subduing her frantic movements and securing her wrists with heavy plastic zip ties. The officer firmly and loudly advised Mackenzie that she was under arrest for federal wire fraud, interstate money laundering, and operating an illicit offshore financial scheme. Mackenzie collapsed into a sobbing, hyperventilating mess. The reality of federal prison instantly wiping away her carefully constructed innocent teenager persona. Seeing the absolute destruction of his sanctuary, Donovan desperately attempted to salvage his own authority. He puffed up his chest, straightening his wrinkled dress shirt, and aggressively marched toward the lead tactical officer. He began spouting a barrage of complex legal jargon, demanding to see a signed search warrant, and aggressively quoting penal codes regarding unlawful entry and procedural jurisdiction. He pointed his finger directly at the commanding officer, threatening massive civil rights lawsuits and demanding they release his clients immediately. The tactical officer did not entertain a single second of Donovan's performance. Without breaking his stride or uttering a single word of debate, the heavily armored officer planted a firm, open hand directly onto Donovan's chest and shoved him violently backward. Donovan flew across the room, slamming hard into the drywall and sliding down to the floor in a humiliated heap. The officer pointed a stern, gloved finger at Donovan's face, commanding him to stand down immediately or face felony obstruction of justice and harboring fugitive charges. Donovan completely crumbled. His arrogant legal facade shattered into a million pieces. He sat on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest in total silence. Bradley sat frozen in the center of the living room. He watched the officers haul his golden boy up from the floor by his handcuffed arms. He watched his daughter sobbing uncontrollably as an officer read her Miranda rights. He realized the thousands of influential people watching the Zoom broadcast were witnessing the absolute end of his legacy. His business was dead. His reputation was incinerated. His children were felons. Bradley slowly turned his head toward the laptop webcam. His eyes burned with an unhinged, toxic hatred. He stared directly into the lens, locking eyes with Sydney across the digital divide. "You witch!" Bradley screamed into the microphone, his vocal cords tearing with the raw intensity of his rage. "You destroyed my children." Sydney sat immaculate in her crimson power suit, perfectly framed in her penthouse office. Her expression remained serenely lethal. She leaned slightly toward the microphone, her voice resonating with cold, unshakable authority. "No, Bradley," Sydney replied softly, her words ringing with absolute finality. "I just stopped covering up your failures." Desperate, Bradley pulled out his phone. He called the one person who hated Sydney as much as he did Beatrice, Sydney's toxic biological mother. The war continued. Bradley slipped out the back patio door of the townhouse just as the tactical team began hauling his screaming children into the armored transport vehicles. He did not look back at the flashing blue lights. He did not attempt to find Donovan, who was currently weeping against the drywall in the ruined foyer. Survival instincts entirely overrode his paternal obligations. He sprinted through the overgrown backyard, hopped a rusted metal fence, and collapsed into the driver's seat of his parked sedan. His hands shook violently as he jammed the key into the ignition. The echo of the police sirens faded into the distance as he sped away from the suburban nightmare. He needed a completely secure location to formulate his retaliation. He drove blindly to the desolate industrial outskirts of the city, pulling into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a windowless dive bar called the Rusty Anchor. It was a dark, damp, and isolated establishment that smelled strongly of stale beer and pure desperation. It was the perfect place to meet the devil. He pushed through the heavy, ruined wooden front doors and immediately spotted her sitting in a dimly lit corner booth. Beatrice wore a sharply tailored emerald coat that looked utterly ridiculous against the backdrop of peeling vinyl seating and flickering neon beer signs. She sipped a martini with an expression of profound disgust, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if everyone present owed her a personal apology. Beatrice was a profoundly bitter, deeply narcissistic woman who had spent the last 3 decades resenting her own daughter. Sydney had achieved massive success entirely without maternal help, and that independence was an unforgivable sin. Beatrice viewed children as investments, and Sydney had refused to pay dividends. When Bradley called her earlier, breathing heavily and demanding an urgent, immediate meeting, Beatrice had eagerly agreed, without hesitation. She thrived on destructive chaos, especially when it involved tearing down the daughter who had successfully cut all ties with her toxic manipulation many years ago. Bradley slid into the booth across from her. He did not bother ordering a drink. His dark eyes were completely wild, deeply bloodshot, and frantic. He leaned across the sticky table, lowering his voice to a harsh, conspiratorial whisper. He wasted absolutely no time on pleasantries. He laid out the entire situation in rapid, aggressive sentences. He told her about the live broadcast, the humiliation, and the brutal police raid that had just resulted in the felony arrests of both his children. Beatrice listened carefully with absolute cold detachment. She did not care about Logan or Mackenzie. She only cared about the powerful leverage this terrible situation provided. Then Bradley dropped the true unexpected payload. He revealed the staggering extent of Sydney's financial empire. He explained the encrypted offshore accounts, the massive corporate holdings, and the flawless, lethal execution of her revenge. Sydney was not just a successful accountant. She possessed immense wealth that easily rivaled minor sovereign nations, and she had kept every single penny completely hidden from her husband and her mother. Beatrice had eyes widening, a sharp glint of pure, unadulterated greed flashing across her perfectly manicured face. The concept of that much money resting entirely in her daughter holding control enraged her. Bradley saw the hook set and immediately pitched his desperate, malicious strategy. He proposed a massive legal assault designed to strip Sydney of her autonomy. He wanted to file for an emergency medical conservatorship. He argued that they could paint Sydney doing public retaliation as the actions of a severely unhinged, mentally unstable woman suffering from a psychotic break. They would claim her actions were highly erratic, dangerous to her peers, and a clear sign of profound psychological deterioration. If they could successfully convince a judge to declare Sydney mentally unfit, they could seize total control of her massive estate. Bradley offered Beatrice an evil bargain. If she helped him execute this aggressive legal maneuver, he would split the millions down the middle. Beatrice did not hesitate for a single second. The prospect of finally dominating her defiant daughter and seizing her hidden fortune was too intoxicating to resist. She leaned forward, her lips curving into a wicked, triumphant smile. She slammed her martini glass down onto the table. "I always knew that ungrateful brat was hiding money from her own mother." Beatrice stated, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "She ruined your family, Bradley. Let us take everything she has." She had spent years trying to find a wedge to force her way back into Sydney life, and Bradley had just handed her a sledgehammer. As Sydney's biological mother, her testimony regarding Sydney's supposed lifelong history of mental instability would carry massive weight in a family court proceeding. She could easily fabricate a narrative of severe paranoia and dangerous delusions, positioning herself as the deeply concerned, loving mother stepping in to save her troubled daughter from completely destroying herself. Bradley let out a sharp, breathless laugh fueled by the adrenaline of a renewed offensive. He pulled a thick, embossed cardstock envelope from his dark tailored jacket pocket and slowly slid it across the sticky, alcohol-stained table directly toward Beatrice. He quickly explained that a standard legal battle would take years and rapidly drain the very scarce resources he simply no longer possessed. He desperately needed immediate, massive funding to expedite the conservatorship and hire a team of ruthless litigators to totally crush Sydney. He tapped the heavy envelope with his right index finger. He revealed he had managed to secure a highly coveted invitation to an exclusive elite private equity gala happening that weekend. The opulent ballroom would be filled with billionaire investors actively looking for lucrative, unregulated opportunities. Bradley planned to pitch a tragic sob story about his ruined family to secure illegal funding from ruthless investors willing to finance the legal war in exchange for a massive cut of Sydney's seized assets. Beatrice would be his star witness, the grieving mother pleading for her daughter's sanity. The encrypted smartphone resting on Sydney's glass desk buzzed with a high-priority notification. She picked up the device, her eyes scanning the brief anonymous message displayed on the screen. The sender was a highly placed contact within a notorious private equity firm, someone who owed Sydney a massive professional favor. The text detailed Bradley's desperate, malicious scheme. He had somehow managed to secure an unauthorized invitation to the annual Sovereign Wealth Gala at the Plaza Hotel that coming weekend. The message outlined his exact agenda. Bradley was planning to pitch a fabricated, highly emotional sob story to a room full of unregulated venture capitalists and dark money investors. He intended to leverage Beatrice's false testimony to secure a hostile litigation fund using Sydney's own massive fortune as the guaranteed collateral. He wanted millions in immediate cash to launch the fraudulent medical conservatorship. Her chief of security, standing at strict attention near the office door, watched her read the message. He had already intercepted the unverified guest list for the gala. He stepped forward, his tone completely professional and urgent. He informed Sydney that he could make one quick phone call to the event organizers and have Bradley's name instantly permanently scrubbed from the security manifest. He could ensure Bradley and Beatrice never even made it past the velvet ropes at the front entrance. Sydney slowly locked her smartphone screen and placed it back onto the glass desk. She reached up to her throat, her fingers delicately adjusting the heavy, flawless diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. A slow, chilling smile spread across her face. The idea of quietly shutting Bradley down in the shadows held absolutely zero appeal to her. She operated in the light where the destruction of her enemies could be witnessed by the exact people they were trying to impress. "No," Sydney replied softly, her voice carrying absolute lethal authority. "Let him dig his grave on the biggest stage possible. Prepare my evening gown." 72 hours later, the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel buzzed with the intoxicating energy of extreme unregulated wealth. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, warm glow over hundreds of elite investors, corporate raiders, and private equity titans. Waiters in pristine white jackets moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and expensive caviar. The room smelled of expensive cologne, designer perfume, and raw financial ambition. It was the absolute pinnacle of corporate power, a room where massive fortunes were ruthlessly traded and lives were casually destroyed over a handshake. Bradley stood near the center bar, desperately trying to blend into the opulent surroundings. He wore a stiff, visibly rented tuxedo that pinched slightly at his shoulders, a stark contrast to the custom-tailored Italian suits worn by the actual billionaires circling him. He was sweating profusely, frequently wiping his damp forehead with a cocktail napkin. The arrests of his children had drained the absolute last of his liquid assets. He was drowning in massive legal fees, impending civil lawsuits, and public humiliation. This gala was his absolute final lifeline. If he did not secure a massive injection of dark money tonight, he would be completely bankrupt and likely facing criminal conspiracy charges by Monday morning. He aggressively cornered a small group of notorious venture capitalists known for financing hostile corporate takeovers. He launched directly into his rehearsed manipulative pitch. He painted himself as a tragically victimized father, destroyed by a cruel, calculating woman. He leaned in close, his voice thick with manufactured desperation, promising them a guaranteed 400% return on their investment. He explained that Sydney possessed an unregulated fortune worth hundreds of millions, completely vulnerable to a swift, aggressive family court conservatorship. He just needed the initial capital to bribe the right medical professionals and file the emergency injunctions to freeze her accounts. Standing firmly by his side, Beatrice executed her role with terrifying, Oscar-worthy precision. She wore an elegant, conservative black evening gown designed to project the image of a dignified, heartbroken matriarch. When Bradley introduced her to the skeptical investors, she expertly produced genuine tears, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She completely validated every single one of his malicious lies. She told the wealthy men that her daughter was suffering from a severe, undiagnosed psychotic break, claiming Sydney had become dangerously paranoid and completely unfit to manage her own massive estate. Beatrice spun a dark, compelling narrative of maternal concern. She insisted that seizing Sydney's assets was not an act of greed, but an act of profound maternal love to stop a deeply troubled woman from destroying herself. She swore to the investors that as Sydney's biological mother, she had the absolute legal standing required to override any corporate defense Sydney might attempt to mount. The investors listened intently, their greedy eyes narrowing, as they rapidly calculated the potential astronomical profits of stripping a defenseless, isolated woman of a hidden financial empire. The dark money executives began exchanging knowing, predatory glances, clearly intoxicated by the sheer scale of the proposed financial slaughter. Bradley felt a massive surge of adrenaline flooding through his veins. His desperate, toxic gamble was actually working exactly as he had envisioned. He could see the investors mentally committing the funds, whispering quietly among themselves while calculating the absolute ruin of his former wife. He was mere minutes away from securing the millions he needed to completely obliterate Sydney and permanently reclaim his stolen dignity. He smiled triumphantly, slowly raising his heavy glass of cheap whiskey to seal the unholy alliance with Beatrice forever. Suddenly, the soft ambient music entirely stopped. The massive, heavy gold-plated doors situated at the very top of the grand ballroom staircase violently swung wide open, crashing loudly against the pristine walls. The atmospheric pressure inside the entire room completely shifted in an absolute instant, instantly plunging the lively, crowded gala into a deep, stunned, unbreakable silence. Everyone turned around to stare in absolute disbelief at the top step. Standing there was not an unwanted intruder, but the famously eccentric billionaire host of the Sovereign Wealth Gala, striking a massive brass gong with a velvet mallet to officially signal the beginning of the highly anticipated open pitch session. The heavy tension in the room instantly evaporated into polite applause as attendees raised their crystal glasses in silent approval. The soft ambient music swelled back through the hidden speakers as the wealthy attendees slowly migrated toward the velvet-draped main stage at the center of the grand ballroom. Bradley exhaled a sharp breath of relief, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He had momentarily panicked, fearing the authorities had somehow tracked him to the hotel to arrest him alongside his children. Now, seeing the host beckoning the desperate entrepreneurs to present their lucrative opportunities, Bradley knew his absolute final chance for salvation had arrived. He grabbed Beatrice by her elbow and aggressively pushed his way through the sea of custom Italian suits and glittering evening gowns, determined to be the very first person to command the microphone and control the entire evening narrative. He practically sprinted up the carpeted steps of the stage, ignoring the annoyed glare of the master of ceremonies. Bradley gripped the edges of the polished wooden podium, his knuckles turning stark white as he looked out over the sea of ruthless venture capitalists. He forced his breathing to slow, commanding his facial features to instantly arrange themselves into a mask of profound, devastating grief. He leaned closely into the microphone, letting a perfectly calculated trembling sigh echo through the massive ballroom before speaking a single word. He began his pitch by describing the complete annihilation of his perfectly idyllic suburban life, his voice cracking with expertly manufactured emotion. He painted a vivid, agonizing picture of a dedicated father and hardworking businessman who had been systematically targeted and destroyed by a deeply vindictive, mentally unstable ex-wife. He did not hold back a single malicious detail, leaning heavily into his fabricated victimhood to secure their absolute undivided attention and immense wealth. Bradley told the silent, captivated audience that Sydney had orchestrated an elaborate illegal smear campaign against his character out of pure, unadulterated spite. He claimed she had fabricated financial documents to ruin his thriving accounting firm, actively bribed local law enforcement to violently raid his temporary housing, and deliberately framed his innocent teenage children for severe federal crimes they absolutely did not commit. The wealthy investors in the crowd exchanged intrigued glances, their predatory instincts highly activated by the sheer scale of the alleged corporate espionage. Bradley smoothly transitioned from his tragic sob story into his aggressive financial proposition. He revealed that Sydney was currently hoarding a massive unregulated offshore fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He explained that her current actions were the direct result of a severe, dangerous psychotic break, making her entirely vulnerable to a swift and permanent medical conservatorship. He begged the room for a massive bridge loan, promising to leverage the funds to seize her hidden assets and return their investment tenfold within 6 months, while completely indemnifying them from any potential legal blowback or public scandal associated with the extremely hostile takeover of her estate. To completely solidify his fraudulent narrative, Bradley stepped back and gestured for Beatrice to join him on the stage. The crowd watched as the older woman slowly ascended the stairs, her hands shaking as she clutched a delicate lace handkerchief tightly against her chest. She looked the absolute picture of a heartbroken, dignified matriarch facing the ultimate family tragedy. Beatrice stepped up to the microphone, letting a single perfectly timed fake tear slide down her powdered cheek. She gripped the podium as if she needed it to keep from collapsing, sweeping her tearful gaze across the room of silent billionaires who were now hanging on to her every single word. As her mother, it completely breaks my heart to say this in public. Beatrice began, her voice quivering with a masterful display of maternal agony. But Sydney is a pathological liar and a deeply disturbed individual. She has spent her entire life manipulating everyone around her, hiding her true nature behind a mask of corporate success. I watched her methodically plan the absolute destruction of this family simply because she thrives on inflicting pain. Bradley is the real victim here today. He gave her everything, and she rewarded him by framing his beautiful children and trying to leave him completely penniless in the streets. She is completely out of control, hiding vast sums of money from the government and her own flesh and blood. Please, I am begging you to invest in this good man, so we can finally get my daughter the psychiatric help she so desperately needs before she destroys anyone else in her blind pursuit of absolute corporate dominance and petty revenge. A low collective murmur of deep sympathy rippled through the opulent ballroom. The dark money investors were completely hooked. They did not actually care about the emotional trauma or the family destruction. They only cared about the incredibly lucrative opportunity sitting right in front of them. The prospect of funding a hostile family takeover to strip a mentally unfit woman of a hidden financial empire was exactly the kind of unregulated, high-yield investment they craved. Bradley watched the greedy expressions shifting across the faces of the billionaires and felt a massive surge of absolute triumph. He had successfully manipulated the most powerful men in the city. The necessary funding was virtually guaranteed. He had finally won the ultimate game of deception against the woman who had ruined him. The soft classical music began playing again as the crowd broke into animated, excited conversations about the proposed conservatorship. Bradley and Beatrice descended the stairs immediately, surrounded by eager, ruthless financiers, throwing thick business cards into his hands. Then the massive double doors of the ballroom violently swung open. The music instantly stopped. The heavy gold-plated doors remained pinned against the pristine walls of the grand ballroom, freezing the room in absolute silence. Every billionaire, venture capitalist, and corporate raider turned to face the entrance. Standing perfectly framed in the doorway was Sydney. She wore a breathtaking crimson evening gown that seemed to absorb the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. The rich silk cascaded down her figure, projecting an aura of lethal, unapproachable power. She did not look like a mentally unstable, vindictive ex-wife. She looked like an absolute conqueror. Beside her stood a man the entire room instantly recognized. Marcus Vance was the notoriously ruthless billionaire chief executive officer of the exact private equity firm hosting the Sovereign Wealth Gala. He was the apex predator of the financial world, a man who never escorted anyone unless they commanded equal or greater power. Together they stepped onto the plush carpet. The sea of custom Italian suits and designer dresses parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path directly toward the main stage. The heavy, rhythmic click of Sydney's heels echoed sharply through the cavernous ballroom, beating like a countdown to absolute destruction. The attendees held their breath, their predatory instincts sensing a massive shift in the apex hierarchy. On the stage, the triumphant smirk completely vanished from Bradley's face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving a sickly pale hue behind. He stared down at the woman he had just publicly decimated his mind, desperately struggling to comprehend how she had bypassed the hotel's elite security detail. Beside him, Beatrice stiffened. Her theatrical tears instantly dried up, replaced by a rigid mask of genuine confusion and rising panic. Sydney did not break eye contact with her former husband as she glided effortlessly through the parted crowd. Her face held a serene, chilling calm that completely contradicted the frantic, unhinged narrative Bradley and Beatrice had just sold to the room. Bradley's panic morphed into blind, desperate rage. He gripped the wooden podium, his knuckles turning white, and aggressively pointed a shaking finger directly at Sydney. He leaned into the microphone, his voice booming over the silent crowd. He demanded that security immediately remove the hostile intruder, screaming that she was a dangerous, unstable trespasser who had no business being at an exclusive financial gala. He waved his arms frantically toward the perimeter guards, commanding them to protect the investors from this deranged woman and secure the premises at once. The perimeter security guards did not move a single muscle. They stood at strict attention, their eyes fixed respectfully on Marcus Vance. Sydney and Marcus reached the base of the stage. Sydney stopped, folding her hands elegantly in front of her crimson gown, her diamond necklace catching the light and blinding the front row of investors. Marcus did not stop. He confidently ascended the carpeted steps, bypassing Bradley completely, as if the sweating, frantic man did not even exist. Bradley stammered, attempting to grab Marcus's arm to reiterate his desperate plea for a lucrative bridge loan. Marcus smoothly sidestepped the pathetic gesture. He stepped directly in front of Bradley and firmly pried the microphone from his damp, shaking fingers. Marcus turned to face the captive audience of elite financiers. His voice projected deep and resonant across the grand ballroom, entirely devoid of the emotional manipulation Bradley had just employed. He began by directly addressing the man standing frozen to his left. He stated firmly that his private equity firm would not be extending a bridge loan, nor would they be entertaining any hostile conservatorship litigation funds. He apologized for the abrupt change in the evening's agenda, but insisted that the room required immediate clarification regarding the actual financial reality of the situation before anyone made a catastrophic investment error. Marcus swept his cold gaze across the room of heavy hitters. He announced that his entire private equity fund, the very institution hosting the gala and managing the wealth of half the men in the room, had been completely acquired at exactly 6 o'clock that morning in a highly aggressive all-cash buyout. The purchasing entity was a shadowy, decentralized conglomerate known as SA Holdings. A loud ripple of shocked murmurs swept through the ballroom. SA Holdings was a legendary ghost in the global financial sector, known for swallowing massive corporations whole and operating with terrifying, ruthless efficiency. No one had ever seen the face behind the corporate veil. Marcus turned slightly, gesturing downward toward the stunning woman in the crimson gown standing at the base of the stage. He requested the absolute, undivided attention of every single investor in the room. He formally introduced the new majority shareholder of the private equity fund, the absolute owner of SA Holdings, and his direct corporate boss. He proudly presented Ms. Sydney to the entire room, letting the devastating truth sink deeply into the minds of the financial elite. The staggering revelation hit the grand ballroom like a kinetic shockwave. The greedy venture capitalists, who had just moments ago been eagerly calculating the massive profits of destroying Sydney, suddenly realized they had been dangerously close to declaring war on their new corporate overlord. They physically backed away from the stage, instantly distancing themselves from the radioactive aura of Bradley's toxic pitch. Bradley felt the invisible ground completely drop out from beneath his feet. The millions he thought he had secured vanished into thin air, replaced by the crushing, inescapable weight of his total financial obliteration. He physically stumbled backward, his legs giving out as his mind completely short-circuited under the pressure. His shoulder slammed hard into a passing waiter. A massive silver tray filled with crystal champagne glasses crashed violently to the polished marble floor. The sharp, explosive sound of shattering glass echoed like a gunshot through the dead silence of the massive room. Beside him, Beatrice remained completely paralyzed. Her jaw dropped open in sheer, unadulterated terror. She stared down at her daughter, finally comprehending the devastating, unfathomable magnitude of the empire Sydney had built in the shadows. The shattered crystal from the dropped champagne tray continued to chime softly against the polished marble floor, ringing out like a death knell for Bradley's pathetic ambitions. The dark money investors, men who built empires on reading the shifting winds of power, immediately formed a wide, isolating circle around the disgraced former husband. He was no longer a lucrative investment opportunity. He was a toxic liability. Marcus Vance stood tall on the stage, radiating absolute authority as he looked down at the pathetic man. Sydney remained perfectly still at the base of the carpeted steps, her crimson gown glowing under the chandeliers, her expression a mask of absolute chilling indifference. She watched Bradley desperately try to form words, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to process the sheer magnitude of his public destruction. He brought her to this stage to humiliate her, and instead she had bought the stage, the building, and the men he was begging for salvation. Hidden near the back of the bewildered crowd, Donovan felt cold sweat pouring down the back of his tailored collar. He had sneaked into the exclusive gala under a falsified guest pass, eager to watch his longtime business partner and closest friend secure the millions they needed to revive their fraudulent ventures. Donovan had banked his own rapidly dwindling reputation on Bradley's success tonight. Seeing Sydney standing there as the ultimate conqueror sent a spike of pure adrenaline through his veins. He backed away from the opulent center bar, intending to slip silently out the heavy gold-plated doors before the devastating fallout reached him. He took 2 steps toward the exit before a sharp, commanding voice sliced through the ambient murmurs of the stunned ballroom. Donovan froze completely, his blood turning to ice. The crowd near the entrance parted rapidly, murmuring in fresh shock. Marching directly down the center aisle, her posture rigid with absolute calculated fury, was his wife. Megan wore a sleek charcoal evening dress, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. She did not look like a woman attending a gala. She looked like an executioner arriving for an appointment. She locked eyes with Donovan, her gaze burning with a fierce, uncompromising hatred that pinned him exactly where he stood. Donovan tried to force a placating smile, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of innocence as he desperately attempted to blend back into the surrounding crowd of wealthy spectators. Megan did not slow her pace. She marched directly past the staring venture capitalists, climbed the first 2 steps of the velvet stage, and cornered her husband right beside the shattered champagne glasses. The ballroom attendees watched in absolute silence, completely captivated by the rapidly escalating drama. Donovan opened his mouth to offer a frantic, whispered excuse. He never got the chance to speak a single word. Megan planted her feet firmly and swung her right arm with devastating precision. She coldly slapped Donovan across the face. The impact was incredibly violent, echoing through the cavernous grand ballroom with the sharp crack of a rifle shot. The sheer force of the blow snapped Donovan's head entirely to the side, leaving a stark, bright red handprint blooming instantly across his pale cheek. He stumbled backward, clutching his face in total shock, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. Megan did not scream. She did not raise her voice or shed a single tear. Her absolute composure made the public execution infinitely more terrifying. She reached into her expensive clutch and retrieved a thick, heavy stack of glossy photographs. With a swift, contemptuous motion, she threw the entire stack directly into his chest. The photos rained down around his designer shoes, scattering across the stage for every single billionaire investor and corporate raider to see clearly. The images left nothing to the imagination. They documented Donovan in Miami, lounging on expensive yachts and drinking vintage champagne with a woman who looked barely old enough to purchase alcohol. "Sydney sent me the bank statements." Megan snarled, her voice a low, lethal whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent room. Every single transaction, every hidden transfer. You completely drained my family inheritance to finance a luxurious lifestyle for a 22-year-old girl. You stole from me, you stole from our future, and you thought I would never find out. Donovan physically shrank under the collective, disgusted gaze of the city elite. The men he had spent years trying to impress were now looking at him with absolute naked contempt. Stealing was one thing, but getting caught so publicly, so pathetically, was an unforgivable sin in this room. Megan stepped closer, her voice dropping to a register of pure ice. You are finished, Donovan. My lawyers are filing the divorce papers tomorrow morning, and they will completely dismantle you. They will leave you with absolutely nothing but the cheap suits on your back. Do not ever try to contact me again. She turned sharply on her heel and walked away. Her head held high, leaving her ruined husband trembling amid the scattered, humiliating photographs. Seeing both Bradley and Donovan completely obliterated within minutes, Beatrice realized her malicious alliance had totally collapsed forever. Cold panic seized her entirely. She frantically changed her tune rapidly, turning away from her disgraced former son-in-law. She practically threw herself down the stage steps, rushing directly toward the woman in the crimson gown. "Sydney, my sweet, beautiful girl," Beatrice cried out, clasping her trembling hands together in a desperate theatrical plea for mercy. "You must believe me. I was completely tricked. Bradley maliciously lied to me about absolutely everything." Sydney did not even blink. She simply raised one elegant hand, gesturing sharply to her private security detail standing quietly nearby. They moved instantly, grabbing Beatrice firmly by both arms and aggressively dragging the screaming, flailing woman entirely across the room toward the massive, heavy exit doors. The heavy, gold-plated doors slammed shut behind Beatrice, sealing her fate and breaking the spell holding the grand ballroom captive. The surviving billionaires, corporate raiders, and venture capitalists did not linger to offer condolences or negotiate terms. Survival in their ruthless financial ecosystem demanded immediate, brutal distancing from weakness and failure. They turned their backs on the stage, flowing toward the exits in a swift, silent exodus. Waiters quickly vanished into the service corridors, abandoning their serving stations. The grand crystal chandeliers overhead seemed to dim, casting long, harsh shadows across the polished marble. Within minutes, the vibrant epicenter of extreme, unregulated wealth transformed into a dark, hollow, echoing tomb. Sydney stood perfectly still at the very center of the large room, her crimson gown glowing amidst the dimming lights, her posture radiating absolute, unyielding authority. Marcus Vance had already retreated to the upper balcony to manage the quiet, ongoing acquisition, leaving Sydney entirely alone to deliver the final strike. Bradley remained completely frozen near the shattered crystal remains of the champagne glasses. He looked entirely hollowed out, a pathetic, broken shell of the arrogant, abusive man who had commanded absolute obedience just a few short weeks prior. His desperate, highly toxic gamble had failed on every single conceivable level tonight. His corrupt accounting firm was legally incinerated. His hidden offshore assets were seized entirely. His malicious, entitled children were currently sitting in cold federal holding cells, awaiting severe criminal conspiracy charges. His best friend had been publicly dismantled without mercy, and his treacherous former mother-in-law had been physically dragged out into the cold, unforgiving streets. He possessed absolutely zero liquid capital remaining. He had no house, no loyal allies, and no bright future. The breathtaking, absolute magnitude of his total destruction finally crushed the last remaining pillars of his carefully manufactured reality. His knees violently gave out. He dropped heavily onto the carpeted stage, the sharp impact sending a tremor through his exhausted frame. The stiff, rented tuxedo bunched awkwardly around his shoulders as his chest began to heave with rapid, uncontrollable hyperventilation. The man who had slapped Sydney, who had thrown her out of her own home, who had mocked her ambition and stolen her legacy, was now physically crumbling. Tears of pure, unadulterated terror spilled from his eyes, mixing with the cold sweat coating his pale face. He looked up at the stunning, powerful woman standing before him, his vision entirely blurred by hysterical, racking sobs. He crawled forward, dragging his knees across the floorboards until he reached the very edge of the stage. He reached out with damp, trembling fingers and desperately grabbed the delicate silk hem of her breathtaking crimson gown. He clung to the fabric as if it were the absolute last lifeline tethering him to the earth. "Sydney, please!" Bradley wailed, his voice, a pathetic wet screech that echoed painfully against the high ceiling of the deserted ballroom. "I have absolutely nothing. I am so sorry. I will do anything you want. Just give me my life back. Please, Sydney, I am begging you." Sydney did not flinch. She did not raise her voice, and she did not display a single ounce of righteous anger. Her flawless face remained a mask of absolute chilling indifference. She looked down at the weeping, broken man clutching her dress with the same detached clinical observation one might reserve for a dying insect on the pavement. She did not see a formidable adversary. She saw a weak, parasitic coward who had simply run out of victims to bleed dry. Slowly, deliberately, Sydney reached down. She did not strike him once. She simply grasped his wrists and gently, firmly pried his sweating fingers away from her pristine gown. She smoothed the crimson silk, erasing the temporary wrinkles caused by his desperate, grasping hands. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them until the intoxicating scent of her designer perfume entirely overwhelmed the stale odor of his fear. She crouched down, bringing her face inches from his tear-streaked cheek. She looked directly into his wide, terrified eyes, letting the absolute weight of her total financial and emotional supremacy crush his remaining spirit. When she spoke, her voice was a smooth, lethal whisper that sliced perfectly through the sound of his hysterical sobbing. She echoed the exact cruel words he had used the night he threw her out into the cold rain, the words that had ignited the inferno of her meticulously calculated revenge. "Clean up your tears, Bradley," Sydney murmured, her tone dripping with absolute freezing finality. "You are making a mess on my pristine floor. Get out of my building now." She stood back up in one fluid, graceful motion, completely dismissing his existence. She turned her back on the pathetic, weeping shell of her former husband. Bradley let out a guttural, agonizing scream, collapsing forward until his forehead hit the floorboards, completely consumed by the dark, inescapable void of his own making, knowing he would never recover. Sydney did not look back. She walked slowly and purposefully down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The sharp, rhythmic click of her designer heels echoed loudly against the marble, a steady, triumphant drumbeat, marking the absolute end of her long war. She pushed open the heavy, gold-plated doors and stepped effortlessly into the grand lobby, leaving the utter destruction of her enemies completely behind her forever. She moved through the opulent hotel entrance and stepped out into the cool, refreshing night air of the city. The bright neon lights illuminated her crimson gown, casting a vibrant, powerful glow around her figure. She inhaled a deep, cleansing breath, feeling the crisp wind against her skin. She had systematically dismantled every single person who had attempted to break her. She had reclaimed her stolen empire, multiplied her vast fortune, and completely eradicated the toxic parasites from her existence. Standing there on the bustling city sidewalk, surveying the towering commercial skyscrapers she now partially owned, Sydney was financially untouchable, emotionally invincible, and completely free.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always me whole. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.